Hello and welcome to the 15th installment of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. It's hard to believe that we have brought you 15 diverse and interesting webinars over these past few months, but I'd like to thank everyone who has spent their Tuesday nights with us. It's a privilege to be able to share these wonderful conservation conversations with you each week. I'm your host, Melissa Howes-Whitecross, and I would like to welcome all of our viewers tuning in through Zoom and Facebook Live tonight. You can communicate with us through the chat room and the Q&A box by typing your questions during the webinar, and our speaker will answer all of these at the end of the webinar. If you're tuning in on Facebook Live, you can send us your questions and comments using the comment feed on the Facebook Live video stream. Let us know if you're tuning in tonight by using the hashtag Conservation Conversations on whichever social media platform is your favorite. And be sure to catch up on any of our previous Conservation Conversations webinars that you may have missed on the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel. Don't forget that you can support the production of these webinars by using the Cricut QR code or the donations website. You can see the link in the bottom of the screen there. We value all of the support received so far, and it's really helping us to keep these webinars free for all to enjoy and learn together. If you sign up as a member for BirdLife South Africa before 5 p.m. on any Wednesday after our Tuesday webinars, you will receive a free Bird of the Year pin badge with your membership. So be sure to check out our website for details on how to sign up as a member of our organization. Please remember that you can sign up for our Conservation League donor competition, where you stand a chance to win a brand new pair of Zeiss binoculars. Please visit our website, birdlife.org.za, and go to the membership tab to find out more. Be sure to enter the Jacana Media monthly giveaway competition, where you could win 3 fantastic titles from Jacana Media. You can visit our Conservation Conversations website to find the link that you need to enter. I'd like to give a shout out to our friends Dave Winter and Mike Buckham, who are back in action tomorrow night with the Better Birding webinar series. They will be hosting Dominic Rollinson with part 2 of the Pelagic Bird ID series. Be sure to tune in tomorrow night and visit their Better Birding Facebook page for more information on this webinar. I would also like to bring everyone's attention to a very exciting campaign which is being driven by our mother organization, BirdLife International. They have a petition running to the United Nations to demand that the UN make it a universal human right to live on a healthy planet. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified at the end of World War II and has had no additions since then. But given the challenges facing our natural world and humanity's survival in light of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, as a BirdLife partnership, we're pushing to make the right to a healthy planet a basic human right. If you'd like to get involved and find out more about this initiative, as well as getting access to the petition link, which you can sign, please visit birdlife.org/healthyplanet. The more people we can get to sign this, the more likely we are to push this important human right through. Now tonight, I am very excited to welcome Daniel Marnewick, Regional Conservation Program Manager at BirdLife South Africa, to Conservation Conversations. Daniel has over 20 years of professional experience in driving area-based conservation initiatives across South Africa, as well as further afield in Africa. Daniel is also the Community Chair for the Global Key Biodiversity Areas Council, also known as KBAs, which I'm sure Daniel will be telling you all about this evening. And he's also the African representative on this council. Daniel, we're really looking forward to hearing all about these high-level conservation initiatives that are taking place across South Africa and the world. And thank you so much for joining Conservation Conversations this evening. If you wouldn't mind sharing your presentation with everyone, then we can get underway. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Melissa. That was a really great introduction. I appreciate it. Just let me know if you can see my screen.
We can. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, awesome. So I'm just going to keep my camera on while I greet everyone, and thank you for joining this evening's talk. And then I'm going to turn it off because hopefully my slides are more interesting than my face. And then I'll turn it on again for the Q&A. So evening, everyone, wherever you are, and thank you once again for joining us. Right. Yeah, when BirdLife started this webinar series, I racked my brain for something different that I could present on. And I'm by no means an expert on COVID, but the topic really interested me, primarily because it spoke to the reason I got involved in conservation over 20 years ago. And the reason was that I felt that cultures were breaking down, globalization was breaking down, geographic boundaries, religions were breaking down, and so I really saw conservation and the environmental crisis, which back then wasn't nearly as serious as it is now. But I saw it as one of the core foundations that were going to guide society's moral and value basis. Our foundation was going to force us to make those value-based decisions that we were no longer making based on religion and culture. And so along came COVID, and I feel that's exactly what it's forcing us to do. So the topic interests me certainly from a philosophical point of view, and so I apologize up front if my presentation is a little bit philosophical. It's also relatively broad, just taking a broad sweep at what the impacts of COVID have been on conservation and potentially will be in the future. My speciality is area-based conservation, which, as Melissa said, I'll touch on during the presentation. Okay, there we go. All right, but before we start, I think we need to acknowledge the tragedy of COVID. I think at this stage, by now, all of us have somehow been touched by this tragedy, either know someone who has been infected or someone who's passed because of COVID. And the numbers are frightening at a global level. Over 13 million people infected, coming onto 600,000 that have died, and South Africa is on the rise. So this really is a tragedy, not just because of people getting sick and dying, but the projected figures are 7 million jobs will be lost in South Africa, and that comes along with a whole lot of other traumas, depression and suicide. And so, yeah, I just want to acknowledge the great tragedy that we face. My presentation is broken up into chunks. So first I'm going to speak about the super year for biodiversity, and then how COVID has impacted our conservation ambitions. Talk a little bit about the opportunity for change. You know, where there's tragedy, there's often opportunity as well, and that's not just for the rich to get richer. I paint a couple of scenarios about what the future could look like, and then what conditions we need to enact that change toward what we want the future to be. So to start, about the super year for biodiversity, 2020. What is it? Because of the global decisions that would have been agreed by most countries in 2020, it was touted as the super year for nature, or the super year for biodiversity. And the year would have been filled with world conferences where leaders in different fields would have debated a new deal for nature. The biggest one would have been the Convention on Biological Diversity. They would have met in China this year at their Conference of the Parties 15, where they would have agreed a new strategy for biodiversity. This would have been preceded by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Conservation Congress in France, where people from all around the world would have got together again, sort of as preceding these discussions around developing this global strategy. And there are a number of other conferences that were set to happen this year as well, on the back of these two major conferences. And really it was around this new strategy. Our previous strategy, which was the 2011 to 2020 strategy, which had 20 targets in it, would be expiring this year. And so 2020 would have been would have seen the agreement of a post-20 strategy, touting at the super year for nature, because it would provide a pivotal opportunity to design a new global strategy that would bring nature back from the brink and pull humanity back from this tipping point that we would see with global natural disasters, such that would dwarf COVID-19. So while the CBD has a really nice 2050 vision, the reality is that we don't have 30 years to achieve that. our window is most likely only the next 10 years to bend the curve by creating this new deal for nature. So what does bending the curve mean? In the face of failing to deliver on the previous strategy, 2020 would be our final opportunity to design a response for the next 10 years that would inspire change. The negotiations around this new deal for nature started last year, and while it was early days, there was already fears that we may only get the same underwhelming deal, but in a different wrapping. As you can see from this graph, that we have seen biodiversity loss, rapid biodiversity loss and decline since the 70s. And this trend has continued despite the policy interventions since the first Convention on Biological Diversity Conference in 1990, and then the agreement and implementation of the Biodiversity Strategy in 2010. And if we continue on this trajectory, we're in for some serious trouble. So this is not the trend we want to continue. And so all new targets need to be ambitious enough to bend this curve upwards. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm in fact just going to focus on 4 that interest me particularly, but these would be the core of what would constitute ambitious targets for the next 10 years. There's been a lot of debate around how much of the earth we need to protect. There's some theorists that talk about half earth, or 50-50, which is 50% for nature, 50% for humans. But the more scientific figure as it stands at the moment is that we need to cover at least 30% of the planet, both terrestrial and marine, with protected and conserved areas if we hope to conserve nature. We also need to be more specific about where we place these protected areas. And so we need to prioritize the most biodiverse rich sites in the world, or what we refer to as key biodiversity areas. We also need to reduce our consumption, as we know, and there's been a lot of talk around meat and the burden of meat on the planet, but we also need to consume sustainably. And then possibly one of the most important things, and something that's become a really hot topic, is how we finance conservation. And we've been talking about this for the last 4 years, really thinking hard about it, engaging the right kind of financial thinkers. But if we want to see this change, then we need to be leveraging money in a different way to the way we have been doing it over the last 30 years. But then cue COVID-19 at the end of last year, beginning of this year. And it's basically tipped the super year for biodiversity on its head. We've seen all these major conferences postponed, most of them to next year, including the smaller conferences. Yeah, and I really see this as the year when nature took control, where humans have failed. Or at least that's the dramatic story I'll tell my grandchildren. But COVID-19 has caused every major environmental meeting to be cancelled or postponed. And discussions to forge this new strategy are now not only slowed, but are overshadowed by the global health priorities and shrinking economies. And the irony is that it's nature herself who said, enough is enough. You know, perhaps this is Mother Nature who heard the murmurings in the back rooms about the negotiation for this new deal for nature, and knew that, you know, this was a serious threat as business as usual. And so she simply said, no, that's not good enough. So as we can all guess, there have been some serious ramifications on the environment and on our conservation efforts, and I'm going to unpack that. Hopefully towards the end of my presentation it starts becoming a feel-good story, but you're going to just have to hang on and listen to some of the bad news to start. And obviously the biggest impact on conservation has had to do with resources. We've seen a significant reduction in resources going towards conservation. Most resources that were intended for conservation are going to be rerouted to assisting recovering economies and supporting healthcare. Conservation organizations and the sector at large is going to have to align with these objectives and priorities if it wants to secure at least short to medium term resources. Governments will reduce resources for habitat management in protected areas and for broader ecosystem restoration. In our protected areas and conserved areas, we're already seeing a reduction in staff capacity, which has impacted the maintenance of infrastructure, reduced anti-poaching patrols, and limited habitat management. Some governments have already taken steps towards weakening or rolling back environmental legislation, and we're seeing that in the United States, in Greece, in Canada, Malaysia, Brazil, and even in Kenya. And we begin to see more of this if we cannot make a convincing argument to continue conserving habitats. These legal efforts to downgrade the protection of protected areas, to reduce their size, or even to de-gazette them entirely, is going to encourage more deforestation and fragmentation of habitats, more ecosystem disruption, which in turn is going to be a major risk factor for the emergence of future zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. But we've also seen a massive impact on tourism, and this has probably been the most obvious impact that have affected us, at least on this call, who are all passionate about getting out into the bush and on our bush holidays. The tourism has all but died, which has impacted regional and local economies, with notable impacts on the livelihoods of the communities living in and around these areas. And these are just some of the statistics. African tour operators have seen, or 90% of African tour operators have seen a 75% reduction in their bookings. This is alarming, because we have 16 million people who are directly or indirectly employed by tourism in Africa. And the most hard hits are those communities living next to these areas that depend on tourism for livelihoods. And we've seen that in our own community. Our community bird guides have all but lost their income, and often they're the only breadwinners in their families. And so that's the reason BirdLife South Africa started a community bird guide relief fund, which I'm sure many of you donated to, who are listening to this this evening, and we thank you for that. And it's not just about putting food on the table during tough times, but we don't want to lose these community bird guides to the sector. You know, we don't want them to go off and get other jobs. We need to keep them in this sector post-COVID-19, and so this fund is really important for that. But these are just a couple of other examples from Africa where this crash in tourism has affected local communities. In Mara and Bosho, in the Conservancy in Kenya, we've got 600 Maasai families that depend on tourism. Those communities living around the Virunga National Park in Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC, who benefit from the proportion of park fees from people who go and see the gorillas. And on our own back doorstep, Hoedspruit, which is very reliant on tourism, has all but come to a standstill with tourism tourism crashing down. But this also has some worrying impacts. You know, with these communities no longer being able to make a living from tourism, it increases the pressure on biodiversity and ecosystems, as these people have to turn to alternative sources of subsistence. And because resources for protected areas have been reduced and we have fewer foot patrols, fewer people patrolling our protected areas, we're seeing an increase in wildlife and human conflict, as well as an increase in poaching. And this is just an example from the Philippines, where they've seen an increase in illegal logging of indigenous trees in their protected areas. And we've seen an increase in the poaching of gorillas in Virunga National Park, and even the poaching of elephants in our neighbor in Botswana. This map is just to show you the impact at a large landscape scale. This is the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, which spans 5 countries. And you can see the dark green areas are the protected areas. But in between there, we have conservation areas. And those are community-owned areas or privately owned game farms that buffer our protected areas, that create corridors between our protected areas. But with this massive loss in tourism, and those communities no longer being able to make a living those sites can soon start threatening our protected areas as they need to start using those resources for their livelihoods. All right, as I said, often tragedy brings opportunity. Certainly one thing we've all been forced to do through lockdown is to get off of our hamster wheels. We tend to rush through life and not see the wood for the trees. But we've been forced to stay at home, and we've realized a lot of things about our lives. This graph really just depicts the process that I'm pretty sure most of us have been through, not only in South Africa, but in the world, when we face a big tragedy like this. First is shock. We can't believe that this is happening to us. We're taken by all the news and the tragedy, but we're kind of still sitting safely at home. Then there's denial, because now it's starting to impact our lives, and what we consider normal, it starts restricting us. Then comes frustration and anger, recognizing that things are going to be different. And we don't know how different, we don't know what the future looks like. But we start getting quite angry and frustrated about it. And then we head into a real dip, which is that depression, where your mood is really low, you lack energy, you don't see a bright future. And then we start pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, and we start being innovative and experimenting and looking for a new future. And that moves up towards making some key decisions and integrating a new future, integrating changes into our lives and society. And so I think we are where that red arrow is now. We're starting to pull out of this depression, and we're starting to really reflect and make key decisions. And so this is a good time to decide what we want our future to look like. And that's just to say that what we really want is we want to finish better. We want to integrate better into a new future. So what have we seen? If we want to design a new future, we need to kind of look back a little bit at the lessons that we've been taught through our COVID-2020 vision. And there are a few things we've learned. Firstly, science has come back to the fore. We've seen more science generated in the last 5 months than we have probably in the last 5 years. There are economists, there are sociologists, environmentalists who are all producing a large amount of science. Economists are talking about a green road to recovery. And in fact, there was a presentation today to Parliament by 3 leading experts trying to outlining what a green road to recovery could look like for South Africa. We've also become very aware of the connection between nature and human well-being. Again, a paper was published last week on the topic. We've all learned a lot about ourselves. We've learned that there's a direct link between nature and our own well-being, and being in lockdown, as soon as I think they lifted level 5 and told us we could get out a little bit, parks were absolutely swamped by people. So we understand the therapeutic effect of natural areas. In Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, the youth who normally wouldn't get out actually started a Facebook page, and they're sharing photos with each other, just being out in nature and enjoying it. We've realized we can work from home. We realize we learn more about ourselves sitting still than running on the hamster wheel, and that we can travel less and meet virtually. We've also learned a little bit about government, that they can in fact change policy and legislation very quickly if they have to. We've learned that they can leverage larger amounts of money and reallocate budgets fairly quickly. And we've learned that we need to better regulate wildlife trade and use. But probably the most important lesson we've learned from COVID is that the health of nature is very much linked to human health, or the other way around. And let's not forget that Ebola, MERS, HIV, AIDS, many other viruses are all zoonotic viruses, which essentially are viruses transferred from wild animals to humans. Sorry. So about 60% of all emerging infectious diseases originate in animals, and those are mostly wild animals. As I've said before, I think there's a bit of an irony that COVID-19 came from humans' exploitation of wildlife. And nature has given us a serious nudge that we can't keep exploiting. That we were waiting around for sort of the impacts from climate change, and we were sitting back as society, waiting until the last minute to deal with this climate change crisis that we were going to face. But we now are forced to engage with the environmental crisis. COVID has shown us that the health of humans, animals, and ecosystems are interconnected. An expanding agricultural frontier and human incursions into natural areas for logging and mining and other purposes has led to habitat loss and fragmentation. It's increased our contact between humans and wildlife and greater exploitation and trade of wild animal populations. This enables the spread of diseases from animal populations to humans who have little or no resistance to them. A new United Nations report warns that more diseases that pass from animals to humans, such as COVID, are likely to increase as habitats are ravaged for wildlife exploitation and unsustainable farming and climate change. And they say that to prevent these outbreaks, countries need to conserve wild habitats. They need to promote sustainable agriculture, strengthen food safety securities, and so on. And none of these are new. We've known this for a long time, and we've broadly ignored it. But we can't ignore it anymore. It's staring us in the face now. What this also speaks to is a human right, and Melissa spoke about this in the introduction. We've always said, a healthy environment is a human right. It's in South Africa's constitution. But I think we've always seen it quite lightly, like, well, yes, it is. It's nice to have a healthy environment and to go visit the Kruger National Park. I think COVID has forced this to take on a new light, what it means to have a healthy environment as a human right. And that's why BirdLife International is pushing this to the United Nations to amend this Universal Declaration for Human Rights to include this right to a healthy environment. And we're really hopeful that this will happen. So in the face of massive economic contractions and human environment health, we need to develop a radical economic recovery that considers the environment, health, and economic growth. And this is called by most a green road to recovery, or developing a green economy. And our response to COVID has shown that a radical approach is not unrealistic, that we can be radical in our ambition to change the economy. It's not out of our grasp, and now is the time to do it. So nature protection should be seen as critical to the sustainable economic growth and human health. But the next question is this affordable? The environment generally receives the lowest portion of national budget allocations. And we've unfortunately already seen our own Department of Environment's budget allocation be cut due to COVID, which threatens the gains that we've made up until now. So can we motivate to change this? I mean, if we look at the sums of money that are being raised by governments, admittedly through massive debts, incurring massive debts, but they've raised over $9 trillion to deal with this COVID pandemic. So this is the highest level of financial support seen during peace times, but it also offers us a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use these stimulus packages to incentivize a more sustainable, fair, and green economic model. The next question we ask is, does this make economic sense? So if we say, if we accept that we want to cover 30% of the world with protected areas, this is going to require an average annual investment of $140 billion by 2030. Currently, we're only spending $24 billion, so we're underspending on the environment based on this projection. However, expanding areas under conservation is going to yield at least $5 for every $1 that we spend by giving nature more room to thrive. This in turn is going to boost agricultural and forestry yields, is going to improve fresh water supplies, preserve wildlife, and help fight climate change, all of which could boost the global economic output by an average of $250 billion a year. Now, I'm no economist, but this seems to make a lot of sense to me. And I know that there are people out there who are saying we shouldn't put a price tag on the environment or on natural habitats, because there's a risk that if a site is not valued in dollars, that it's going to be easily destroyed. And I accept that. But the counter is that we need to do something differently, because we've been failing to raise the money to conserve our natural habitats. and something needs to change. And if we want to raise money, we're going to need to speak the language of economists and financial experts. Just to put this into perspective for you, it feels like we're talking about a lot of money, but these are figures from 2012. So the figures have changed, but the proportions have stayed pretty much the same. Where that little red circle is, that is essentially what we should have been investing in protecting nature. At the time was $80 billion US. And we were currently only spending 10% of that on conserving nature. But what I want you to look at are the bigger blue circles to the right of that, which showed that we were spending $252 billion US on agricultural subsidies. The next bubble is even more astounding. Nearly $470 billion US was spent on soft drinks around the world. Now, if we can spend that amount of money on soft drinks, why aren't we able to leverage the money to conserve nature? It just simply doesn't make sense. And I just stole that that quote from Jason Hickel on Twitter, which really speaks to how warped our economic model is right now. So we have the money, it's more about changing our spending priorities. Coupled with economic change is social change, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of consumer demand, something that we saw with the recent hype around plastic straws. And there are essentially 4 factors that influence social change. The first is choice. We can't change if we don't have choice. We need science, we need technology, we need policies to develop alternatives for us. And then those alternatives need to be accessible and affordable. Otherwise, we can't change to them. We need to recognize that we are communities, we are social beings that thrive in relationships, and our sense of normal is often defined by our community and our leaders. And that's called the community consciousness. And then lastly, it's about our personal change, changing our personal lives, changing our core values and what our norms and our choices are every day. So, back into some gloomy stuff, but what could our future look like post-COVID-19? And I took these 3 scenarios from the paper by Hawkins et al., which was published last week. And there are 3 possible scenarios. One is there's a return to normal. 2, there's a global economic depression and decline, and basically we go into potentially another dark age. And then scenario 3 is really that light at the end of the tunnel. So the first scenario is a return to normal. So we adapt to COVID-19, we come up with a treatment and an effective vaccine, and although we see an economic recession for 1 to 3 years, we end up returning to our old model of economic growth, which means we have the same amount to spend on conservation, which means we're still underfunded, our protected areas and conservation areas especially, but so also our NGOs. And the environmental crisis persists as it had been last year, except now we've lost a year to try and address it. Scenario 2 is really gloomy. It speaks about a global economic depression, a complete decline in conservation and protection. The pandemic lasts longer than we anticipated. Unemployment rises, businesses are shattered. It means lower taxes going to governments, which sees a crumbling of infrastructure and municipalities. We see a global economic depression, a dramatic decline in conservation funding. As we see job losses in urban settings, those people return to their rural homes, which is going to place additional pressure on natural resources. Tourism continues to decline. Support for NGOs decline. Governments have massive stimulus packages, but they have a single focus, which is job creation. And we continue to see environmental regulations weaken as governments try and access natural resources that they can then sell and export. But then there's a third scenario, and it's a new transformative relationship with nature, that we look through our COVID-2020 glasses and we actually learn from our past, from our current experiences to paint a new picture. And this one's quite long, but essentially it speaks to humans developing a new relationship with nature. It's about having this shared or common cause across countries, that we've shared this tragedy, and that has created a shared bond with the planet and each other. We've got a new appreciation for the way we consume and degrade and misuse nature. We clearly understand now the relationship between human health and natural health, and the relationship between climate change and biodiversity loss. We've got a new appreciation for the outdoors, for clear skies and clear water that we've seen coming back with humans being locked in their homes. We appreciate science, which I think we've all turned to over the last few months. We gladly see oil prices fail, and a resulting swift move away from fossil fuels, which allows for the introduction of nature-friendly and climate-friendly future and renewable energies. We've already seen economists, central bankers, and finance ministries identify natural climate solutions and rural support for ecosystem restoration. We see responses spanning ecological and habitat restoration and the protection of natural areas and human health built into economic recovery. We see an ambitious new plan for the CBD. So it's not business as usual, but they actually come up with ambitious targets that aren't driven by politicians, but are driven by true needs. And we see an increased commitment in funding for conservation. So that's a far more rosy picture that I think we all want to see at the end of the day, but we are going to have to really be deliberate about achieving that. We cannot sit back and wait for that to happen, or wait for politicians to do that. It's going to require all of us to invest in this new future. So I'm just going to unpack a few of the foundational things that we need if we want to see this change. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I might go through these a bit quicker, but I've broken this down into global change, regional change, and then what we would need for national change. Globally, we need change in spending. So we need governments to spend more on green technologies, on green infrastructure, on restoring natural habitats, expanding our protected areas, and coming up with new innovative financial investment structures. We need new policies. We need policies that are going to support local economies, that are going to build biodiversity economies, regulate wildlife trade, that promote renewable energies and reduce our reliance on these fossil fuels, and that will invest in new technologies that are accessible and cheaper for the vast majority of people. We need social change that includes personal, societal, and change in certain sectors. And we need to give, for this change, we need to support it by giving people alternatives, increasing awareness around the relationship between humans and the environment through appropriate messaging, through leadership, and by directing consumer demand. And then lastly, to achieve our 2030 agenda for the Convention on Biological Diversity, we need to state that we deliver on transformative and green recovery packages, both focusing on finance and policy change. Regionally, what we need to see is we need to strengthen our protected and conserved areas. When governed and managed effectively, they can not only support biodiversity, but also human health and well-being, contribute to food and water security, disaster risk reduction, climate mitigation, adaptation, and local livelihoods. We're going to have to be very specific about how we save our protected areas, because make no mistake, our protected areas are in dire straits. Sand parks, who I think get at least 70% of their income from tourism, is being very deliberate about how they address this crisis, or they are facing bankruptcy. And so they are coming up with a rescue, recovery, rebuilding, and expansion strategy for our national parks. And all countries need to be doing this for their protected areas. And they need to start that planning now. But more broadly, we need stronger cooperation across the SADC region. our own Minister of Environment, Honourable Minister Crises, chairs the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment. And I think South Africa really needs to lead the charge, particularly in the SADC region. We've got a SADC Secretariat, which now needs to step up and help coordinate this. And we've got massive trans-frontier parks. So we already have multilateral country cooperation through these trans-frontier parks. We've got a wildlife economy that's seen a massive push over the past 2 years, but COVID has shown its vulnerability when being heavily focused on ecotourism. It's therefore important that we partner with the finance and economic sector in order to diversify our wildlife economy income streams. We need to focus our conservation investments in the most important places for biodiversity. However, unlike South Africa, most African countries haven't identified even their most threatened species and ecosystems, never mind mapped where they occur. And as experts in the field of red listing of threatened species and mapping biodiversity using global tools like key biodiversity areas, South Africa needs to support our neighbors to do the same using these global frameworks, such as KVAs, and using safeguard mechanisms such as other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. I think what we need to realize is that Africa is one of the poorest continents, and projections are showing that by 2030, 90% of the world's poor will live in Africa. If we don't fix this problem, Africa is going to sell its soul in the way of its natural resources for export. And so we need to ensure that conservation includes benefit sharing that is equitable for all the people in Africa. Nationally, starting off with this green economy, which is really taking root, financial experts are already thinking about and engaging government in the development of a green economy. And what you see here is an excerpt from an article published in May in Fin24, outlining the framework for a green economy. And this afternoon, 3 of the key experts, one of which authored this paper, presented a lot of this to Parliament, trying to encourage them to develop this green economy. The IUCN NGO members in South Africa have also been engaging with the Minister of Environment Affairs to assist her to make the argument to her government counterparts. But these efforts need to be coordinated and focused, and we need to avoid silos pushing their own agendas. We need to engage, we also need to engage in the right skill set to help us develop this green economy. And as you can see in front of you, nature-based solutions to achieve human well-being and to tackle climate change are well within our reach. And if we ensure that our stimulus includes these measures, which focus on climate and nature-positive, labor-intensive sectors, we could potentially create 500,000 new jobs, according to a World Bank study. And these would be in renewable energies, waste management, sustainable transport and green infrastructure, remediation of polluted lands, and the preservation or restoration of natural areas that provide these ecosystem services to us. Right, enough text and a couple of pictures, but this is just speaking a little bit more to other national changes that we may want to see. So using this opportunity to create more green spaces, particularly in urban settings, and getting people out enjoying and appreciating nature, particularly the youth. And bird watching here is a massive opportunity. It's one of the things we can enjoy on our back doorstep, and many of us already do, but it's a way to encourage people to engage in green spaces. We need to increase our green infrastructure, and honestly, South Africa needs to stop messing about with their renewable energy policies. They need to start agreeing on real renewable energy policies and investments, and start increasing our reliance on renewable energies and away from fossil fuels. And then perhaps, hopefully, we have fewer load shedding incidents. We also need to recognize the potential for job creation. So already we have created a number of jobs through our extended public works programs, like working for wetlands and working for water. It's included local skills development, local job creation. And so we need to bolster these programs again. There's massive investment by government into these programs, but they've often been unfocused, a little bit sporadic. Their investments have been undone when they don't follow up with invasive tree clearing, for instance. So we need to revive this, and we need to do it better. We also need to recognize that despite the massive slump in tourism, it is one of the biggest employers. It employs more than the mining sector. So this needs to be recognized, and we need to make a strong argument to government to embrace this. Then just briefly, this is one of my fortes at BirdLife, is we need to focus on key priorities for biodiversity. So let's not invest in landscapes just because there's no other economic value to that space, but let's invest in the most important spaces for biodiversity, regardless of its other values. And South Africa is already leading in this space. We've mapped our biodiversity from wall to wall. We have an extensive network of important bird and biodiversity areas. We'll soon have an extensive network of key biodiversity areas. We've mapped strategic water source areas. And so it's more about getting political will to recognize and conserve these places. And then my last slide is around our protected areas. South Africa is probably one of the only African countries that's still expanding its protected and conservation area network. And that's because we've got a very progressive program called Biodiversity Stewardship, which expands protected areas onto privately and community-owned land. And this is 70 to 400 times cheaper than the state buying and managing land for protected areas. So really the point is that in South Africa, we've already got awesome programs. We don't have to create that much more to address the challenges we face from COVID. What we need is better coordination of our conservation efforts, particularly across government departments and between government and the private sector, including between NGOs. And we need to make sure that we are directing our investments to the most important places for nature. It seems like an abrupt end to my presentation. And I think in conclusion, what I found through my research is that the environmental crisis hasn't changed, but this COVID pandemic has highlighted a lot of things for us, particularly this relationship between the health of humans and the health of nature, and what our very own actions are doing to expose us to these risks, these health risks. But it's also forced us to ask very hard questions, and we need to use this as an opportunity for change. And that starts now. It starts today. It doesn't start post-COVID. It starts today by the choices we make in the future we want to see for ourselves. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel. Wow, we really are on the precipice of some major changes in the world, and let's hope that we can push for scenario 3 to happen. It's really great to see all the sort of strides being made across the various sectors, not just here in South Africa, but globally. And let's hope that our leaders have the foresight to really take advantage of this moment in history where we can build that green economy. So thank you for joining us and for sharing that amazing story. We really do appreciate you giving us that broader insight. So before we take questions, just a quick reminder to everyone, please remember that at the end of the survey, you're going to get a little survey popping up. Please do fill it in and let us know what you thought of tonight's webinar and answer some of the other questions that are posed to you. Next week, Alistair McInnes, Seabird Conservation Program Manager, will be sharing his conservation story about the birds of the Benguela bounty with all of us, and how working with the fisheries industry is helping further the conservation of these endemic coastal birds. We'll also have a guest host who some of you may remember from the AV Tourism webinar a few weeks ago. Andrew de Block is going to be stepping in on my behalf, as I'm going to be out in the Eastern Cape with very little cell phone signal, unfortunately, but I'm sure Andrew will do a superb job and take excellent care of all of you. So if you have any questions for Daniel, please remember that you can type them into the Zoom Q&A box, as well as the Facebook Live comment feed for those of you tuning in on Facebook. But I think it's time to run the gauntlet, Daniel. I hope you're ready. And we're going to kick you off with a question from our honorary patron, Pamela Isdell, who's tuning in once again. We always enjoy your support, Pamela. So thank you so much for making the time for us. But Pamela was asking, that it's sad to see that the plans for the 2001 to 2020 sort of conservation policy is not done so well. Do you have any sort of ideas and suggestions as to what some of the shortcomings of those policies may have been?
Sure, yeah, that is quite that's a good question, and it's a tough one to answer. I would say that the two biggest reasons for many of those targets failing is that they weren't realistic, and the reason they weren't realistic is because the people who came up with those targets just simply didn't engage with all the sectors that needed to be engaged with. These targets were finally agreed in a dark room at the 11th hour. And so they didn't speak to the needs of the broader community, I guess. They didn't speak to the needs of a number of other sectors. As I said, our new targets need to make other sectors part of the solution, not only part of the problem. And the previous targets didn't do that. Ironically, the only target that we really did do relatively well on was the area-based target, which was to conserve natural areas through protected and conserved areas by expanding those to 17% of terrestrial and 10% of marine. And we managed to achieve, I think it's 15.9% of that 17% as a global average. So that's relatively good. But yeah, the rest of the targets we didn't do well in, and I think it's just because of the way they are negotiated, and we're seeing that again now with these new targets. The way they're negotiated is just very, very frustrating, and you can understand you're trying to attend to a world of comments and needs, but yeah, I think it could be done better.
Thanks, Dan. I know that was a tough one to answer. We've got an anonymous question here, but Anonymous is asking, what is the bigger challenge? We hear a lot about the climate crisis, and you've highlighted the biodiversity crisis. How do they differ, and how can we address them both effectively in order to prevent this supposed collapse that's coming?
Wow, I thought the first question was. They are different. So I think the biodiversity crisis is really about the amount of biodiversity that we're losing, species and ecosystems that are threatened, that are going extinct, and that in turn threatens the health of ecosystems. Climate change is very similar, except it's got a very clear source, which is because of human activity. We've increased carbon emissions, and we're changing the temperature of the planet, and that change in temperature is affecting the climate, which in turn affects a whole lot of other things, which also threatens nature's ability to provide us with clean water and fresh air and functioning habitats. So we can address the challenges on both fronts through similar actions. And I'd say the obvious one is safeguarding our intact natural habitats, especially large landscapes of intact natural habitats. Is the best way to deal with both biodiversity loss and climate change.
Thanks, Dan. I totally agree with that. We've got two questions, one from Marco for sure, and the other one from Dale Steele. They both really enjoyed your webinar, and they're asking whether it's possible to access further reading on this topic, and whether you have any suggested papers that could be shared that are sort of aligned with some of the thinking that you presented tonight. Perhaps maybe in our show notes, if you wouldn't mind giving me a few references people should have a look up, we can share those in your webinar show notes. But off the top of your head, besides the Hawkins paper, are there any good resources where people could go and read more about this?
Yeah, there are lots. As I said, there's almost a new article or journal piece that comes out every day. And I'm happy to share the resources that I looked at for this presentation. I think it depends on what you're interested in particularly. If it's around the green economy and the finance, there's quite a lot that's being generated. And ironically, an ex-BirdLife staff member, Candace Stevens, has started up the Biodiversity Finance Coalition, which is putting together some of our leading finance experts to think about how we better leverage finances for conservation. And obviously now they're thinking very seriously about the green economy and how to stimulate that. But yeah, I'm happy to share the papers that I've read somewhere. I can't think of any others off the top of my head. The Hawkins paper is really interesting, but there are quite a few more.
Thanks, Dan. That'll be great. And sort of leading off of your mentioning Candace, the chairlady of BirdLife Port Natal, Nicolette Forbes, is asking if it's possible to just give a little bit more information around the address that was given to Parliament today in terms of the Green Road to the Recovery. And do you know if there's a YouTube recording of that talk?
Sure. So it was a live YouTube stream. I need to find out if it was recorded. I seem to think it was recorded. And I'll find the link and make that available to everyone. I don't know if you've got a distribution list, Melissa, but yeah, I'll find the recording. So Parliament's doing this quite regularly. I think there's another one scheduled in August, which focuses specifically on the financing of protected areas, and we can share the link to that. But today, the three experts that were talking to Parliament was someone from National Treasury, the I think CEO of National Treasury, and now with Standard Bank, and then Candace Stevens from this Biodiversity Finance Coalition.
Thanks, Dan. So Eleanor Mary is asking, or sort of stating, that it's always important to emphasize that zoonotic diseases do not transmit to humans from healthy wild animals in their natural habitats, but from humans exploiting and abusing our natural world. And it's really important that the safeguarding of these systems is protected to try and help minimize this risk. And she wants to know, I'm not sure if you can answer this one, Daniel, but what is the situation regarding wildlife markets in China and some other countries around the world?
Sure. Yeah, I can't give you a very clear answer. I know that there have been some wildlife trade. Melissa, you could probably answer this better than me, actually. I'm trying to think of the words. Wildlife trade restrictions have been put in place, and I know that China has changed something with regards to the medicinal use of certain wild species. So we are seeing changes coming in, probably not enough yet, but they are there. But I can't give you a clear answer on that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously the enforcement of these new regulations is always where the true proof in the pudding comes. So hopefully as these regulations come online, the sort of national guards of all these different countries are able to enforce them and hopefully help minimize the impacts of these wildlife markets. Penny Abbott's asking, do you think we have a solid scientific basis to understand how to drive green economic recovery?
Yeah, I certainly think we've got a fairly solid economic basis. There's been quite a lot published. As I said, there have been some documents coming out of the World Bank. There's a lot of global thinking around this. So I know a coalition of NGOs in Britain have pulled together a really nice strategy that they've presented to government around a green economy there. I think the trick is, and as conservationists, we've been quite bad at this over the last 20 years, is that we've tried to be economists, sociologists, scientists, conservationists. We've tried to be the whole package, and we're not. We're not very good at seeing understanding our limitations. And so we need to better collaborate with the key experts out there, and we need to start talking to those economists and financial experts, to the sociologists and anthropologists and so forth, to really pull together and improve our impact.
Absolutely, and I think in that parliamentary address you mentioned earlier, the Standard Bank representative made a very clear point that as investors, they don't want to invest in businesses that are not going to give them good returns in the future because we didn't address the sustainability issues now. So I think it is definitely in the minds of a lot of these major corporations that we need to factor in the environment and factor in good sustainable practices. So let's hope that that rhetoric continues and starts to be taken up more and more as we move forward. We've got two questions here linked to, you mentioned the tourism aspect and how sort of green economy links to economic reform in the tourism sector. So the first part of this question is from Craig McFarlane, and he's asking whether we as BirdLife South Africa have any involvement in trying to help government reopen the tourism sector and what's being done to try and lobby better local travel going forward. And the second part of this question is from Scott Warburton, speaking towards whether we're seeing a push from younger people trying to get into conservation and tourism going forward, and whether they see it as a realistic career path to pursue, particularly given the challenges we're seeing with COVID-19.
Yeah, so I think the first question, probably our colleague Andrew Block is on this call and is very much involved in the AV tourism sector, promoting AV tourism and working with our community bird guides. Is very much involved in trying to promote the tourism sector and revive it again. We are part of the IUCN coalition who's engaging with government, and a big thrust there is also to try and get the tourism, particularly the local tourism sector, up and running. So BirdLife's very much involved in that. The second question, sorry, Melissa, just remind me.
I was looking to younger people getting involved in conservation.
Oh, yeah.
And pursuing it as a career.
Yeah, it's certainly something that BirdLife is pursuing. We've got a fairly active intern program which supports young professionals coming into the sector. But I think it is something, something that we should be doing more of. There are some key national programs in place, like linked to the Groensewense, trying to encourage young people into this sector. Probably not enough, but it is something that we're trying to address.
Thanks, Dan. We've got a question from Robert Mulder asking about strategic water source areas. Now, I know this was led by WWF South Africa, but is this a sort of South African publication, and where is it accessible for people to go and have a look at?
Yeah, so I would go to WWF South Africa's webpage. They have published the maps there. I think it's also published on SANBI's web pages, which is the South African National Biodiversity Institute. You can probably download the maps from them if you type in strategic water source areas. It's fairly unique to South Africa, and essentially what they did was that they mapped all of the most important water source areas that are feeding economic hubs. So it is fairly specific to economic hubs. But interestingly, what came out of it was that something like 7% of, or was it 8% of surface area feeds 50% of the nation's water requirements, which is really significant. And so that speaks to focused investment. Those are the areas that we should be investing in.
Absolutely, and given that our climate change predictions for South Africa is that we are going to become more arid and water stressed going forward, and I'm sure our listeners tuning in from the Cape are very much attuned to this water scarcity issue. Putting our conservation investment into these key water providing areas is so important. And I know BirdLife's got a number of biodiversity stewardship initiatives, as well as some of our species work in those high altitude grassland strategic water source areas. So it's very much at the forefront of what we're trying to do, as well as many of the other NGOs in South Africa. So it's great that we have tools like this to guide the kind of work that we're doing here in South Africa. So we've got a question from a whole lot of letters and numbers, so I'm not sure who this is, but they're asking, is there a political will to translate the green economy into reality? Do you find that our politicians are sort of amenable to this green recovery that we're all proposing?
So the short answer is I think they're probably more amenable now than they have been in the past. Whether that's enough, I'm not sure. So I know that our own Minister of Environment is very amenable to this. She wants to make a case for this, definitely. I think something that maybe is disappointing is we haven't seen the innovation come to the fore yet. So today's presentations, a lot of it was sort of rehashing what we already know, what we've seen, what's failed. There was only one presentation that in my mind really spoke about innovation and what the future could look like. And I think that's what needs to be taken to government with some real practical examples. You almost have to build the entire puzzle for them. You have to show them the examples, outline it, explain to them exactly how it will work. And I think if you can get their ear to listen to that, then there is a chance. And as I've said in the presentation, it's now or never. If we don't manage to make this case for the environment now, I don't see how we're going to do it in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I think you've really drummed home just how pressing this cause really is and how urgently we need global leaders, and not just here in South Africa, to react to the seriousness of this biodiversity and climate crisis. Now, we've got two quite lengthy questions, but they're both speaking towards the move from sort of coal-based and historic energy sources more into the renewable type sector. And obviously our colleague Sam Ralston-Payton, who gave a talk early on in this webinar series around renewable energy, particularly wind, and the movement towards wind energy in South Africa. Are we seeing a willingness from government to do better when it comes to greener energy and cleaner energy going forward? In your experience, do you think that there is buy-in to move to these more renewable sources, particularly now?
Questions just seem to be getting harder. In South Africa, no, I don't believe there's enough buy-in, to be honest. I think we're still too coal dependent, and a lot of that is politically motivated and led by corruption. So no, I don't. I think we've kind of been messing around in this renewable space, but never actually done anything concrete around it. We kind of jumped from fracking to nuclear to wind energy to solar energy back to fracking, and there's just never a hard political position taken on this. And then, as you say, as the comments said, we keep trying to bail out Eskom and build new fire station, coal-fired stations. So yeah, I'm not convinced that our government has bought into it enough yet. But if we can demonstrate how many jobs we could create through this green infrastructure and renewable energy, especially at a time like this, I don't see how they wouldn't bite at it. And with this World Economic Report pointing out the 500,000 jobs, new jobs that we could create through this green infrastructure, it really does make sense. So I think coal's time has come. It was coming already. It was dying. And we're literally pulling out all the rubbish now and trying to sell it. But I think hopefully now that this is the nail in the coffin for coal, and it's going to force us to look to renewables more seriously.
Yeah, I think we should let those fossilized dinosaurs lie and move on to more innovative technologies for sure. So we've got a question here from Emma, and I don't know if we can actually put a number to this, but she's asking, what would the percentage of BirdLife conservation in conservation as a whole be? And would you say that it needs more attention? And I think as BirdLife South Africa, we definitely use birds as our sort of conduit for the conservation work that we do. But a lot of what we do, and I'm sure people have learned this over the last couple of webinars, is actually very much environmentally focused. And we use our birds as more of a flagship than anything else to draw people in and make sure that we're getting those landscapes secured for biodiversity as a whole. So birds are very much at the face of what we do, but we've always got the environment as a whole in the sort of underpinnings of what we're trying to do. I don't know if you want to add anything more to that, Daniel.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. As you said, they're really good flagship species, and you know, if we can focus on securing those habitats, it's not only for birds but all the other biodiversity that also occurs there.
Definitely. So I think there is a question here about rhinos, but that's not really our forte. So sorry, Michael, I'm gonna skip over that one. I'm not seeing any other questions coming through, Dan. So I think we'll maybe leave it at that. But I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and thank you, Daniel, for really giving us something to think about. And I think just banging home once again how important it is that we take this conservation story and make it mainstream and get buy-in from our political leaders, because if we don't turn the tides now on this natural disaster that's really headed our way, we're in big trouble as not just humanity but the planet. So thank you so much for sharing with us tonight, and I really enjoyed your talk, and I hope everyone else out there did. I see by most of the comments in the chat room everyone's had a great time. So thank you, Daniel, for coming on to Conservation Conversations. And with that, I'm going to say good night to everyone, and keep enjoying those birds outside. We are headed for some rocky roads with this COVID-19 outbreak in South Africa, so please stay safe, stay home, practice your social distancing, and make sure that you are taking all the precautions to try and avoid catching this awful disease. And to those who have been affected, our thoughts go out to all of you, and we're thinking of everyone that is struggling under these insane times. So stay safe, everybody, and good night to all of you.
Cheers, everyone.